justice.
Welcome to episode 73 of I Fought the Law podcast. No, what did we decide?
Did it.
This is 13?
This is
13. Brian's had a lot to
13.
drink. Oh, bloody hell. We start off just saying the number of episodes, and it already goes to Taylor Swift. This has to stop.
No, it doesn't.
That first episode was supposed to be the serious
Taylor,
one, by the way.
For the love of God,
Just come
or
on the
whoever you
podcast.
believe in, come on the podcast. If Taylor Swift comes on the podcast, do you promise that you will stop talking about her?
I will never stop talking about Taylor Swift.
If anything, he'll become insufferable at that point.
Yeah.
I saw some. Okay, sorry, this is a tangent. This is a tangent, but I need to say
No,
it.
I want to
Producer
tangent.
Zach
How
just
about
got pretty excited. I'm excited for this.
There was an article that a active shooter broke into a church, went to shoot the pastor, and the gun jammed. And the number one comment on that article was like, he's going to be insufferable now.
Oh yeah. That's exactly right.
It's like Pulp Fiction when he not a
I
single
laugh, but I don't know that reference.
You've
What?
never seen Pulp
What?
Fiction?
No.
Get
We've
out of
talked
here.
about
Oh
this.
yeah. Brian can't handle
Get away from the board wall.
Brian
Don't get the
can't
board
handle
wall.
blood in movies.
Really?
But I can tell you the complete plot of Legally Blonde
That's exactly right.
The
Legally
bloodiest
Blonde,
movie.
or
out of nowhere because we didn't plan on discussing it that
he
day.
could tell you what the fourth track on the Folklore album is.
Your mom.
Nice. That was good.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Hold on.
Uh,
I've got to vent, or I've got to talk about how you screwed up the last podcast.
no, I did not screw up.
You absolutely screwed it up. I was working on a transition to get into the topic for today because for the viewers, we record two at a time, which is why we did not switch shirts this time. I'm not putting on your shirt. It's too late.
No, it's okay. I'm just going to take mine off, so I'm in a different t-shirt.
He's
Okay.
just,
You're
he's
welcome,
just
viewers.
cooling off.
Yeah.
Teton gravity research.
Perfect. So
Just
I
in
was
that area?
working.
On my nipple?
It's a very localized research.
yeah,
Well, it's starting to
I thought
sag.
you
So
meant the area
No.
of the shirt, and I was like,
no, I thought he
quit
was talking
staring
about.
at my nipple, Zach.
Well, it does say gravity research, and that's starting to sag. So,
No, I'm not going to say it.
but let me
Not
get
the
back to
only
my
thing
complaint.
sagging.
We plan ish 2 podcasts at a time,
Yes.
and we had a actual legal one last time, and then we had a food one. I thought we would do the food one second. So last time I was transitioning from the legislative process into what we were about to talk about today.
No.
And Brian says, recipes are online as the transition to food. And I went, I was this close from connecting the dots, Brian, in a
And I'm
legitimate
thinking
way.
in my brain, what is he talking about? Because I'm trying to get to food.
Well, either way,
But here's the thing is I had said the last 2 episodes were not very fun because we were angry. So let's do the fun one, food first, before we get to the more serious one. And you said, yeah. So forgive me for thinking, hey, we're going to talk about food first.
you know what? You're right, because that is all the preparation we had for these 2 podcasts. It lasted about 10 seconds, and I know
Yeah.
there was
Can
a
you-
sexual joke there that you wanted to make.
No, I
but-
didn't.
Yeah, you did. You gave me the look.
It came
The
out.
viewers are going to see the look.
No, they'll see the look. But
I
you
said lasted
brought it
10
up.
seconds, and Brian turned into a 13-year-old boy, which is absolutely what I would have laughed at if I was not on the podcast. But either way, so now I'm left with a weird transition into today's topic.
Yeah. But I did want to mention one thing.
Please.
We suck at our transitions today and knowing where the other is going because I brought up our buddy Jason who went to Dick Shooter, Idaho to take a picture with his kids.
Oh, yeah. Dick Shooter, Idaho, legitimate place.
Yes.
Yeah, real.
The band. Just last week.
Wait, I was going to say Google it, but please don't Google Dick Shooter.
Please.
Google Maps.
Can we get
that's
some
all-
sort of like waiver or disclaimer here on the podcast of like, this is
Richard-
not legal advice.
Richard Shooter.
Do not, under any circumstances, Google Dick Shooter.
It's like my brothers live in the Caribbean, and my mom was like, "Where do you live again?" That's the voice she has. Sorry,
Mhm.
Mom.
Oh, I know.
And they said, "Oh, it's called penisland.com." And so my poor mom is typing in penisland.com inadvertently and going, "Oh, you boys." So that's
Got
my
it.
brothers.
I love your brother. I love your whole family so much. I make a lot of jokes about Debbie, and Debbie's made a lot of jokes about me, and those are great. And but
She doesn't have a podcast, so
she doesn't.
My
But
brothers are cooler than me. I fully
your brothers are
accept it.
great. Your sisters are great.
Yeah.
You got a great family. That's all I'm saying.
Living
go,
in
Steve.
penisland.com.
Penn Island.
Please don't Google, do not Google Dick Shooter, Idaho, and do not go to penisland.com.
Should make t-shirts.
Anyways, I cut you off talking
Yeah.
about Dick
Oh, yeah.
Shooter, Idaho.
Last week, the band was able to play another show, Run
That's
Amok. This was a fun event, very different from others that we've done, but it was a fundraiser for a local teacher who has cancer.
Mhm.
And this wonderful woman put together a performance with us and our buddy Heath Harmison, the stand-up comedian, and had a very nice dinner and a comedy set by Heath. And then we played, and it was fun.
Yeah.
It was a good event. We were sort of background noise, which was probably good.
Yeah.
In fact, he probably could have been further in the background, but but it was a good show.
Absolutely.
And kudos to Heath's mother, who was the wonderful woman that put this together. Through her efforts and everybody who helped her out, they raised over $22,000 for this
Wow.
teacher. So,
That's the first
That's
I've heard
awesome.
that figure. And that's great. He's totally deserves the support. He took it graciously, and we wish him the best
very
in his journey and hopefully soon recovery from cancer.
for sure. But we're not here to talk about band today. We're not even talking about music today, Steve.
Or food.
Or food.
We should talk
Or
about food.
The legislative process.
So I can just say, "Oh yeah, steaks are good," but what about that legislature? And then it would be about the same transition as
Yeah, it
Brian
would.
last time, saying, "Oh yeah, the internet exists and food is described on it in recipes."
food
There are
is on the
recipes.
internet. Go.
I think didn't we get a Giada De Laurentiis
Yeah,
mentioned on the last one?
You
Yeah.
did.
So
You
let's
still-
add her
you
to the
even did an
list.
Do you still have a crush on her?
I don't watch as much Food Network anymore.
me
I don't
neither.
watch as much like live TV or
Yeah.
cable TV or anything like that. But
I have to believe that you would still have a crush on her, though.
if she appeared today making some spaghetti
If she appeared
with
today,
orecchiette, broccolini,
Is she invited on the podcast?
she would be invited on the podcast.
if she were to appear before me,
If she were to. We should do a podcast on that story too.
this is not
Why
the serious
the-
podcast. This is not that serious one of the two.
No, it hasn't
no
started
chance.
that way.
There's
It
no
has not.
chance.
So all the better. Let's transition into some less funny shit. Like, I don't know, government overreach or
Let's talk about BlackRock, and they're taking up all of the United States homes, and no one can buy a home anymore. How do we feel about
Man,
that?
Yeah.
you went really
wow,
good.
this got dark real quick. I think that's probably on me.
I'm a
Yeah.
young man with no concept that I'll ever own
we
a house.
we really do not have a skill set in transitioning or keeping, like the last episode Brian was talking about something funny and then switched to a injured baby.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
great.
Lawsuits are fun.
I think the more you drink, the better this is going to go.
Actually, that story from the last episode might come in handy today in discussing some of the things that we talked about.
Yeah, and so I am going to transition in. Last time we talked about Brian and I, how we met, and we had decided that we were going to partner up over food up in Coeur d'Alene, eating some fine burgers. So there's the food. But in talking about sort of what we anticipated in our firm, I was doing a lot of criminal defense. I was actually doing a little personal injury back then, but Brian came in and took over that practice. And we were like, how do we make these two jive both in a business model and in a concept? And the more we thought about it, the more we were like, you know what? We're both are doing the exact same thing. we're representing an individual and not big corporations or not the big guy. We're representing
Big
the
brother.
little guy against the big powers. And I think we've even mentioned that on prior podcasts.
Yeah.
That we sort of take pride in this. And something happened to me this last week that I came in just livid about the area of law that I practice. And I said, can you imagine if this was in your realm? And he said, it is.
It is.
And so
100%.
we want to talk about sort of the us fighting the powers to be. So getting back into that, for me, I fight my clients are charged with crimes against the state of Idaho, and especially in the state of Idaho, where right now it's we're a big back the blue state. There's an assumption that everything that the either prosecutors or law enforcement do is the good arm of justice, and what I do is just poking holes in loopholes,
Looking for loopholes. Yeah.
that I'm looking for loopholes, and not realizing that I represent a small individual with usually not that much money going against a huge system, and you're the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. If I mean fighting insurance companies, fighting medical associations, the Idaho Board of Medicine and its lobbying powers, the influence that not only they, but their insurers,
Mhm.
the major health, malpractice insurers are pushing to get passed in our state. It 100% is the David versus Goliath, and it's crazy. And so these folks that come forward do so, one, out of necessity, and two, in my practice, at least, it's elective, right? Yours, it's not so much of a choice. No one's going to choose to be prosecuted. But for me,
Right.
they're choosing to go through this process because
saying that the big system wronged me, and
the
I
big
want to
system
sue.
wronged me, and I need somebody who can take them on. And I need some help navigating that system. Never easy to do. And obviously it's a system that is, the powerless versus the powerful.
Right, and that's the nature of it. Is that we're always representing an individual going against a much stronger, much more influential, much more well-funded
Mhm.
power, and here we're fighting against it. So let me tell you what happened to one of my clients, or the change that I saw this last week. And I am sure that some people listening have had DUIs. Okay.
Yeah.
So I do a lot of DUIs in criminal law. It's the type of crime that we see the most of, like the average person, if there is such a thing. If they're involved in the criminal system, it's usually a DUI. They had too much to drink. They're, and they drove. And
Right.
by the way, don't do that. Get an Uber.
Far cheaper.
Far cheaper than hiring me and going through the process and all of
And
that.
much better than living with having hurt somebody or killed somebody because of your choices.
Absolutely. I in no way condone drinking and driving, but when somebody does and law enforcement comes in and charges them with a crime, I get involved. And there's a lot of steps to a DUI. But I'm going to jump to the important ones. I'm not going to this isn't all about DUIs. One of the important ones is when the officers are testing somebody for DUI, they use an instrument on the side of the road to test your blood alcohol level.
Or the layman, the breathalyzer, right?
Yeah, the breathalyzer. And in Idaho, we have 3 different kinds. The one that's used the most frequent is what's called the LifeLock 200, and it is on the roadside, and it's a little handheld device. And all law enforcement going through post or training as an officer get trained on how to use the LifeLock, and some get trained on the Intoxilizer 5000, and some get trained on the third one, which is more new. But there are operating procedures on how to use this, because it's a very specific instrument. And if you use it wrong, it can produce the wrong results. And the last thing we would want is for it to produce the wrong results, and especially read too high. And then all of a sudden, somebody that does not have a blood alcohol level over 0.08 is registered in the machine as having a blood alcohol level
and
over 0.08.
like any machine, it's going to, degrade over time and not be as accurate, and it needs to be recalibrated and things
That's
like
right.
that.
So, and it's truly a testing instrument. I mean, you think we're taking this like lab with us with law enforcement, and a lot of law enforcement don't have lab experience or college degrees or any sort of scientific training, but they get trained. And so they're out now following operating procedures on this instrument. And part of it is a critical part is to ensure that the instrument is correct. They actually have to observe you for 15 minutes prior to the instrument, and they're supposed to do certain things. And their standard operating procedures say check the person's mouth because foreign objects might be in it that might be soaked in alcohol. And so as you're breathing, the foreign object in your mouth might be caught in your breath and you're blowing, and it would raise the testing,
like piercings or
yeah.
similar.
Oh, we'll get into that. So,
Yeah.
or say like dentures.
Oh, okay.
With denture glue, maybe that denture glue held on to some alcohol.
Oh, wow.
So that's all of these are challenges to when we get the reading. So this last week I had I've had two clients come forward and say, you know what, I've had a chewing tobacco product in my mouth during that 15-minute time period, and it got me excited for the case because in years past that would nullify the test result, because the idea is, let's say you had tobacco or say a Zin pouch in your mouth, and especially if you drank with it, potentially the alcohol, let's say this has alcohol in it, I drink it, some of that alcohol might lodge into that foreign object and might stay lodged there. And then when it's now an hour later and I'm taking a breathalyzer because I got pulled over, he's walked me through standard field sobriety tests, and I go to blow, that alcohol in there might come out and raise the standard.
Would that even do something with like gum or something similar you would have?
So gum, and all of these have been challenged.
Wow.
But so what I told these clients is I said, we may have a claim, and you would think that I would say, hey, we got a good case here, but I know what really happens. We've been talking about the legislative process, about legislatures writing laws that directly relate to us. But there's a second process that we have, and that's an administrative process to where they create a different entity and say, you get to regulate X. Well, in this instance, it's the sheriff's, basically the Idaho State Sheriff, and they get to write the operating procedures for this instrument. And now they changed the operating procedure, which still says the officer should look into a person's mouth to make sure that it's cleared. But then they added a note that says, if a foreign object is left in the mouth during the entirety of that 15-minute monitoring period, any potential external alcohol contamination will come into equilibrium with the subject individual's body water and or dissipate so as not to interfere with the results of the breath alcohol test. So this is what happened. A bunch of criminal defense attorneys made a bunch of challenges to officers that forgot to test the mouth.
Check the mouth.
Check the mouth. And just so happens there was stuff into it, and they lost on those DUIs. Those people went free. So instead of going, hey, officers, we need to train you better, they said, you know what? We've lost too many cases. Let's just change the operating procedures.
We're just going to say it doesn't affect anything.
Yeah.
Instead of training your officers, making them do better work, making them better police officers, let's just change what the standard is.
We're just going to change the standard, and we get to do that. We as law enforcement get to write our own rules. And think about how disingenuous that is for those that aren't trained to do this portable lab test. And then when they keep screwing up, they go, we're just going to change the operating procedures of the lab and act like it's the same. Let me give you another example based on the exact same. I have one client that it used to be on that LifeLock that it says you have to get 2 test results. And if you've ever had this, I've watched hundreds of videos. I've never done a breath alcohol test with law enforcement. I think I've done it for fun. But you blow multiple times, and to blow in these, you have to like really blow for like 10 seconds.
Right.
I see the sexual joke that you just
Actually,
had.
I wasn't even listening to you. I was smiling because he was adjusting the camera.
And you just
I just
wanted
wanted to make
good.
sure I was getting the smile on.
That was
Yeah,
a coy little
anyway,
smile.
The
But-
two results. You were
Okay,
saying
so-
something about two results.
So with the LifeLock, the old test results required 2 results, and those results had to be within a certain amount of each other. If they were
Mhm.
greater than 0.02, and it still says that if they get 2 results, they have to be less than 0.02 away from each other. Otherwise, it says, hey, something must have gone wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
one of them is off.
Yeah, one
Too
of them
much-
is off,
too
and
much
then
deviation.
they have to continue to give you breath result until 2 of the numbers are within 0.02 of one another.
Right.
Well, now it's rewritten, and it says, well, if you get one and then something screwy happens with the other ones, like if they don't blow long enough, you can declare it a problem with the test person, and 1 result is good enough.
And they can just take whichever one they want.
No, and
Yeah.
they've only gotten 1. So now they give
Okay.
1. So in
just
my
one.
case, my client blows. It comes at a little bit over 0.08. Then officer goes to give him another one. It registers as insufficient. He kind of says, hey, you need to go harder. He tries again, registers as insufficient. And then he goes, this is your problem. And he just chastises my client, who's a very elderly man and would have a difficult time. Now, mind you, if they don't get a breath result, they can get a warrant to draw your blood, which will give you the result. But in this case, the officer is saying, oh, I got 1. That's good enough. When all of the operating procedures say we need 2 to make sure that the testing process is correct. It's all about taking a portable lab test with you and making sure that you went through the operating procedures. But because it was so hard to get 2 results and they don't want to have to go draw blood, instead they just rewrote it and said, we don't need 2.
Just one is
if you
fine.
get 1 and you think the guy's screwing with you, 1's fine. And so now that negates me filing what's called a motion in limine to bar it for the officer failing to do it. And this is not a recent thing. This is in 15 years of practicing law, I've seen these operating procedures on the LifeLock changed yearly. The attorneys come in and say, hey, you guys aren't doing it right. And they lose a bunch of cases. They go, let's just change it. And so in essence, and this is the nutshell, through the administrative process, these big powers that we go up against have the ability to self-regulate. Does that make any sense to you?
No.
Right.
No.
Where's the checks and balances?
I went into
There is-
Brian with this rant, and I was like, this is bullshit. Like here, they have all the ability to train them correctly. They have all the money to hire as many as they need. They can bring in specialists to train them on this portable lab. And I was like, can you imagine this being part of your insurance world? And he sat for a minute and said,
Welcome to my world.
that's it.
I mentioned in the last podcast, and I do a lot of this work, medical malpractice. And our state, in the name of tort reform or whatever you want to call it, we've
Mhm.
talked about that in past episodes, in the name of protecting doctors, has given our Board of Medicine an awful lot of leeway in making calls and making requirements for people who have a claim of medical negligence, that hoops they have to jump through in order to bring those cases. But the biggest thing they got achieved was this. They said that they got legislation passed that in order for any plaintiff to succeed or even bring a case of medical negligence, they had to have an expert so an expert doctor, obviously most likely in the same field. Sometimes that's not true, but for the most part, they're in the same field, same experience, same, area of practice, an expert to testify that they breached the standard of care, which is great. Yeah, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's generally the requirement in any medical negligence case.
So break it down a little bit simpler. I go to a doctor and he decides I'm going to treat you with X.
Mhm.
And he commits an action, and I get harmed from that.
Yes.
What I would have to show as a plaintiff that would be your client is I would have to show that that doctor screwed up and that there is a standard of care that he's supposed to do in that instance with the factors that I demonstrated with and treat me accordingly. Is that right? Or is that too complicated?
That's pretty simple. Yeah. A simple explanation of it. Idaho took it a step further and said, we are going to require, because of our Board of Medicine and our legislature, and they said, we are going to require that you not only have an expert to testify about the standard of care, but that they be familiar with the local standard of care. Meaning you have to get a lawyer from that same community, or excuse me, a doctor from that same community to come in and testify and say, this is the standard in our community, and that doctor violated it.
Instead of a national standard of care.
Somebody coming from the outside. In the days of, 1950s medicine, when nobody had the internet and or the ability to network like we do now. And so maybe the care you got in Dick Shooter, Idaho versus New York City might be different. And they don't have any real way of, comparing Dick Shooter versus New York City. But now you're saying you got to get a doctor from Dick Shooter to testify that most likely his business partner or friend or at very least colleague was the one that
competition.
Yeah.
And instantly subject to impeachment.
Right.
When he testifies.
That they violated the standard of care. So we adopted what's called a local standard of care, which requires knowledge of the local standard,
which allows the doctors to
just all get together and say, this is what the standard is. This is what we do. I don't see any breach of our local standard here.
So, and mind you, how many doctors do you know that get trained solely on local standard of care? They get together and because they have continuing education requirements, how many of them in Dick Shooter, Idaho are like, hey, let's have the Dick Shooter, Idaho training? None. They all go to trainings that are nationally.
Yes.
Or
national standards. We have the ability now to jump on the internet. If you go into your doctor, you start talking about shit, they pull up WebMD.
That's right.
And they're pulling up, symptoms and what it might mean and that sort of thing. We have
scary.
the ability now to call colleagues that we have. In a legal case, we've talked about stories in the past. I've called lawyers in New York City to say, hey, I got this going on. What should I do?
Right.
I called lawyers in Florida, California, Louisiana, you name it. I can do that with like that.
You can hop
Something they didn't
on a
have.
face-to-face Zoom call with them and consult with them.
Doctors can get their patient in front of that specialist on video that day.
And so they're getting trained nationally, they're networked nationally, they're learning national standards of care. But then when they come back and say there's only a few,
we screwed up.
Yep, we screwed up. Oh wait, no, that is the standard of care where we live.
That's what we do here in Twin Falls, Idaho.
So just like law enforcement going, you know what? We might have screwed up. So let's just change the standard operating procedures on the LifeLock. These doctors can get together and say, you know what? We screwed up, but I don't want to have to pay out, and I don't want my medical malpractice insurance to pay out. So let's just say that the local standard of care is different from everywhere else.
It's like the adult version of playing army with your friends. You're like, I shot you. Like, no, you didn't.
Yeah,
you have a different gun. You don't have that gun.
Yes, 100%. And it's equivalent of, let's just say we were in a much smaller town, or even better, let's just say we're in our similarly sized town.
Right.
But that all the lawyers fell under the umbrella of one big corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And that corporation comes in and says, okay, this is our standard.
You mean all
here.
the doctors?
The corporation that employs all of the doctors, or in this scenario, hypothetical, employs all of the lawyers. This is our standard for doing things. That becomes the standard.
Right. So, and what Brian's getting at is in our area, we have one big hospital and some individual practitioners, but the much bigger power to be is the big hospital. So, and they have numerous doctors. And so
numerous lawyers.
and numerous lawyers. And so all they have to do is define their own standard of care in any given circumstance, and they can write out what the law is.
Like a
The best-
doctor, like a doctor HOA.
Yeah. It is a Dr. HOA. That's
Yeah.
a great point. The best way I've heard it described is from my old boss who told me to shut the fuck up in the last episode.
Yeah. Sorry, Bonnie.
No, blame that one on Ken. And Bonnie knows Ken. So
You
it's good.
repeated it. Sorry, Bonnie.
Sorry, Bonnie. Is if the doctors get together, if you go in and your child needs surgery and they say, well, on kids, we anesthetize by hammer. So we're just going to knock them out with a hammer and then we'll fix their broken bone or we'll fix their lungs or we'll fix their heart, whatever they have going on. We're going to knock them out with a hammer. We're going to do that. And if all the doctors get together and say, that's our standard, there is no negligence when your baby ends up dead because they anesthetized by hammer, even if that's not the way they do it anywhere else.
That's right.
The rest of the world says we use anesthesiologists, and that's the standard. And that's what's readily available to everybody on the internet and on doctor blogs and on, professional networks and at the Mayo Clinic and everything. They say we're going to anesthetize babies by hammer. That's the standard. And if they kill your baby because they hit them with a hammer in the head to knock them out, you have no claim.
Yep.
Unless you can bring somebody that's decided it's okay to anesthetize babies with a hammer to come in and testify that they did something wrong.
And look at
Wow.
we see different standards of care or different standards under the law for those that write it all the time. For example, the government in our legislative process, if we want to sue a government entity in the state of Idaho, the government has written a different standard that for notice of tort claims.
Yeah.
Instead of a 2-year statute of limitations, we have a 6-month statute. of limitations.
180 days.
180 days. If you want to sue a government, and that was the legislature coming in saying, well, we don't want to get sued. We can't completely nullify it. So instead, let's tighten it up and created a notice of tort
Let's
claim.
make hoops for you to jump through.
There are thousands of examples of this, of the big player, whether it be local powers hiring lobbyists to get these powers in so that they could create their own rules, whether it be an individual entity delegated power by our legislature to write their own rules and regulate themselves, that they just get to write their own rules and they may not be right.
The crazy thing is we have one local hospital. It's the only one here.
Yeah.
It's the only one up an hour and a half north in Blaine County. And it's one of only 2 in the Treasure Valley. And they literally flaunt this. They flaunt this shit. They
Oh, that's
lobbied
right.
to get it passed. And then they come in and they literally had billboards and posters up in their buildings that said, setting the national standard of care locally, meaning our standard is what the rest of the world follows
And it's
because it's so fucking good
sorry.
that this is the only standard that should be followed. But when it comes to us screwing up and killing somebody, then we come in and say, well, this is only what we do in our community. It doesn't matter what the rest of the
It's
world
bullshit.
says.
It's
It's
complete
bullshit.
bullshit.
They should be ashamed of themselves.
I got you worked
I'm
up
big
again.
into shaming people these days on the podcast.
Yeah, I've noticed.
I should shame myself.
Yeah,
Sorry, sorry, Mom.
we got you worked up again, Brian.
Screw them.
I know.
I mean, not only do they have a monopoly on this community for medical care, but then to do shit like that,
See-
that makes it perfectly fine when they kill people.
But my example is different from yours, and this is probably hyper technical for a podcast, but it's worth noting. On yours,
nerd.
I know, nice. But on yours, you literally can't even bring a cause of action. It
Right.
shuts you down completely.
Yeah.
On mine, I still have the ability. It shuts me down from bringing a motion saying that the officer didn't follow standard operating procedures. But I would still have the mechanism to hire an expert to come in and say, no. Even though the SOP says that, that's not right. Okay, they followed standard operating procedures, but the test result isn't good. So I still have a second bite at the apple.
We don't.
You don't. It
We
shuts
don't.
you down.
It shuts us down completely. And going back to my example of all of the lawyers in our community being owned by the same entity, being
Yeah.
employed by the same entity.
Yeah.
And they come in and they say, Brian and Steve screwed up a case. and they expect our friends down the road
To
come in and
against us.
testify, but our employer says, let's just say we really screwed up.
Yeah.
We know we screwed up.
Yeah.
But our employer says,
No,
hey, you guys down the road, you can't testify against Brian and Steve because we employ you.
Oh yeah, it's
And
yours is a
No one
horrible
else
law.
in our community can testify because we employ them all. And you can't talk to lawyers. Meaning there's no way for somebody who's wronged by us screwing up entirely to seek any sort of redress, whether it's killing somebody, whether it's causing them a lifetime of harm,
Yep.
whether it's a mountain of medical bills. There is no recourse because there's nobody locally to come in and say, hey, Brian and Steve screwed up. Thankfully, the bar hasn't pushed for this for lawyers. It's just our doctors. And our
Yours is
hospitals.
even worse though, because then the hospital that has written its own rule that allows it to be negligent then hires the lobbying power to go out and talk our fine community here to believe that there are frivolous lawsuits.
Right.
This is all your fault, Brian,
This
for
is
calling
on
them
me.
on it when they are the ones that have absolutely created a system that can harm individuals, and the individuals in our communities are coming forward and saying, back the blue, you have frivolous lawsuits. That's the most frustrating part about representing the small person against the power to be, because it's not only their ability to change the rules, it's their ability to get messages out that make us seem crazy. And all the while we're on the ground level with individuals going, this is wrong, but the rules have all changed and everybody thinks that we're the devil.
We're the bad guys. The
Right.
number of lawsuits has gone down. The number of payouts have gone down. What's the one thing that's gone up? Insurance premiums.
Yeah.
So when doctors complain, they say, well, we pay so much in malpractice insurance. We got to do something about these lawsuits. Go fuck yourself. It's not, sorry about it, the lawsuits. It's not the payouts. It's your insurance company raking in millions in profits and saying it's all Steve's fault. It's all Brian's fault.
That's right.
Even though we've rigged the system.
Steve's just the guy looking for a loophole in the cops scheme. And I'm going, they're not a lab technician and they're performing a roadside lab test.
Yes. And part of the reason
that's just wrong.
I love the song that this podcast is named after, a Tommy James song made famous by The Clash. I fought the law, that the law deserves fighting sometimes.
Yeah.
And this bullshit is the stuff that needs fighting.
Yeah.
And so hence the reason I love The Clash. Hence the reason we named the podcast
That's right.
this. It's bullshit. But if you think your legislatures, when they pass stuff like this, have your best interests at heart,
You're
think
fooling
again.
yourselves. Yeah. Hey, Brian, you know what just happened?
What?
We just had a podcast that we talked about the law.
I fought the law and the
No, we'll get sued if you
we'll
finish
get sued. Don't sue us, Clash. The Clash would never sue us.
I
Do you
think
know
they
why?
might. Because you sport their shirt on some of the podcasts.
Yes, and I wear their socks.
Oh, yeah.
And
And they're cool.
they're cool. And Joe Strummer would never do this shit. He wouldn't sue me.
Well, till next time and that we talk about Taylor Swift some more.
And the Clash, but mostly Taylor Swift. Maybe some Pearl Jam.
Yeah.
And maybe some Frightened Rabbit.
That's it.
And other local spirits.
That's it.
Cheers, friends.
Cheers.